So welcome back, everybody. Hopefully the caffeine's kicking in to carry us through for the last couple of talks of the day. So this afternoon, what we wanted to do to kind of round off the day is invite some of our, a couple of fantastic research teams that are based in the local area to come and give you a bit of a flavour of some of the current research that's being done into Fragile X in the UK. So I'm really, really pleased first to introduce you to Kate Woodcock, who's from here at the University of Birmingham, and has just been wonderful at doing research into Fragile X through the years, and we're really, really grateful for the support of you and your team. So I'm delighted to introduce Kate to talk a bit about the research that they've been doing into Fragile X.
So, is that loud enough? No, I'll hold it then. Hang on a sec. Put that in there. Okay, is that loud enough? Yep, great. So I'll come out this way. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the research that we're doing here in my team. So ultimately, I guess all of the research that we do has three main things in mind. Because all of the research we do is ultimately for families, what we want to make sure is that the things that we're researching are those things that are important for families, and that's something that we always bear in mind. And what we try to understand is how thoughts and feelings can come together in pathways to affect behaviours that can be important for families, sometimes because they might be challenging. And once we've developed our understanding of those kinds of pathways, we try to use that information to then develop helping strategies. And so what I wanted to do today is to plug two of our current ongoing / forthcoming research projects. So I just want to use those two projects as examples of those two main foci that I've just talked about. So what we've done in some previous work was try to think about what a pathway to these things that we were calling temper outbursts. Try to think about a pathway to those things called temper outbursts. So what we mean by temper outburst is a sort of explosive, quite uncontrollable reactions. Sometimes people call them meltdowns or blips, and there's lots of different words. And I'm going to come back to that terminology later because you'll see why. But in some early research that we did, we were interested in these sorts of outbursts because families told us that those are really important. And we looked at them in some boys with Fragile X syndrome and some children with other neurodevelopmental disorders, for example, Prader-Willi syndrome, which I've put on this slide. And one of the interesting things was that we saw that in boys with Fragile X syndrome, these outbursts were much more anxious looking. So when you look at the outbursts, you can see that boys look really anxious. Whereas in the other disorder that we looked at, actually the children were looking much more angry. So we had these two things that looked quite different on the surface. But when we, sorry, I'm going to go ahead so that I can see what I'm doing. When we dove down into it, we actually found that both of those kinds of outbursts could be triggered when things changed in children's routines. And that was really important for us in thinking about these pathways. Also, we know from our research, but also research from lots of other groups, that both boys with Fragile X syndrome and some girls with Fragile X syndrome can have difficulties with this cognitive skill called task switching or cognitive flexibility. And that was the same in individuals with this other neurodevelopmental disorder, Prader-Willi syndrome, that we looked at. And task switching is basically changing from thinking about something in one way to thinking about that same thing in a different way. So the example I always give, if you've heard me talk before, you'll have heard this example, but if you're trying to eat a boiled egg with a teaspoon, you first have to think about that teaspoon as a heavy hammer-like instrument that's capable of breaking open the shell of the egg. But then if you want to actually eat the egg with that teaspoon, you have to change how you're thinking about the spoon and think about it as like a concave instrument that's capable of scooping out the yolk. So that's what task switching is. So we had these two commonalities, even though the profiles of the behaviour were quite different on the surface. And that comparison, along with lots of other similar comparisons, allowed us to develop a pathway. And this is just one possible pathway to the kinds of anxious outbursts that we can see in boys with Fragile X syndrome. And so that pathway is that we get a change that happens in the environment, and that change puts a demand on this task switching or cognitive flexibility. And then because that cognitive process is deficient, then that creates a state of anxiety and can trigger an outburst. As I said, that's just one pathway, but that's a pathway that allowed us to start thinking about certain strategies for intervention. And so I'm going to then talk about one of our projects that started to do that. And this is an early intervention project where what we're trying to do is to think about, could we give children growing up with Fragile X syndrome, could we tailor their environments so that we give them the maximal possible opportunities for developing this cognitive flexibility that we think is important in this pathway to the behaviours. So how we started to think about this is based on a few pieces of research. So we've done some experimental research to show that if you expose children to a change to a fairly new routine that they haven't had for very long, they cope with that change much better than if you expose them to a change to a routine that they've had for much longer, which is quite intuitive if you think about it, but nevertheless I think it's important to know. And we also have a few different lines of evidence that suggest that that children that grow up experiencing slightly more flexibility in their environments might be those children that then later in their lives tend to have fewer difficulties with change. And there's some really important work from the sort of cognitive neurodevelopmental literature that shows that children around the age when task switching and cognitive flexibility typically develops quite quickly, if children are exposed to more flexible environments around that age, then actually the task switching develops more quickly. So taking all of that together, that sort of set us thinking, okay, so what if we try to tailor children's environments to increase the flexibility from an early age? Could that then train the cognitive flexibility so that then later in children's lives they have less difficulty with change? So, you may raise your eyebrows at this, and you'll be quite right to do that, because there's another very important thing with change, which is ultimately it's very good to structure environments to minimise children's exposure to changes. Because if you think about, okay, a change causes a problem, of course if you minimise the number of changes that the child has to deal with, then there's going to be fewer problems. So it's definitely advised in lots of different settings that you should try to plan and structure things as much as you can to minimise that anxiety. But the problem, of course, is even in the most the family that is already most structured and loves routines and finds routine really easy, there's still going to be some situations where you can't plan it, you can't structure it. And certainly as children get older and start to become more independent, this complete structured approach is almost certainly going to fail. So we definitely need something else anyway. And obviously what we're thinking is then the flexibility might be really important for training the cognitive skills that are important. So what we're trying to do with the flexible scheduling project is strike this right balance. We acknowledge that structure is important, but we want to give families a tool to balance that structure with appropriate flexibility to try to push the development of these cognitive skills that are really important. And to do this, we believe, and this is what we did, that it's really important to collaborate with families and other stakeholders throughout the development process, because then whatever tool we develop, we can be much more optimistic from the start that it's going to meet the families' needs. So this is quite a busy picture, but it's just to summarise the sort of key aspects of the research that we did. The first thing that we did was to develop what we fancily called design criteria, but they basically just a set of specifications for how we think this tool should look. So we interviewed quite a lot of families, so more than 40 families of children, not just children with Fragile X syndrome, but children with Fragile X syndrome and other neurodevelopmental disorders that face difficulties with change. And we identified key things that our tool must do in order to meet our objectives in the view of families, and also meet other families' needs. And then once we'd got those criteria, we used them to basically come up with an initial sort of draft of the design for our tool, and sort of drew that out, if you like. And then we went to families and said, okay, so what does this look like to you? And we discussed this draft and did a few rounds of development so that we were sort of collaborating to make our design better. And then we got it to the stage where we could develop it technically into a fully working prototype so that families could use it at home. And then some families tested it at home to see if it would fit into their lives, if it's acceptable, and if it's feasible to use, you know, just for those 2 weeks, because that's really important before we develop it any further. So what do these specifications for this tool look like that we developed with families? I just want to highlight a few really important ones. So if we're going to encourage children to be flexible, first thing that families told us was it's critical that parents are in control of that flexibility, because parents know what's going on in the day, they know what's possible, they know what mood the child is in. They need control over what's going to happen and when. But if children perceive parents as being in control of the change, then actually families told us that's going to be difficult, because there was a lot more opposition to things that parents suggest if they were suggesting the flexibility. So what families told us was, you've got to remove that responsibility in the child's eyes from my shoulders. It can't look like it's coming from me. But even though, so if you like, the child must feel like they're in control. But even though it's really important that the child feels like they're in control, actually a lot of children experience, parents told us that a lot of children experience difficulties around making choices when the choices have to do with flexibility. So the tool also needs to support that choice making for children. So our bright idea for how we would do this is to integrate a game-like element into the game, into the tool, so that the game would take control for the flexibility, but the child would control the game. So the child would feel like they're in control, but they don't have to make any choices because they're coming from the game. And then parents also told us that it's important, sometimes they couldn't really think about how to try to integrate more flexibility and this balance between structure and flexibility. So they said that it's important that the tool helps them to think about that balance between structure and flexibility, and that it helps to communicate the plans to children, and really importantly that it helps to manage anxiety around the change. So from these things we basically decided that it needs to be simple to support this sort of educational element, and it needs to have multiple supports. So we developed it just up to the point, so we designed sort of everything that you like, that we wanted to include, if you like, so all of the multiple supports, and that's what we discussed with families. But then what we developed in our prototype are just the fundamental elements that allow us to create this balance between structure and flexibility. So this is what the prototype looks like. So it has a parents area, and from the parents area, basically they can plan the day. And within their plan of the day, they also plan the flexibility. So you can see here that, oh yeah, I've got mouse. So you can see that dinner time is where they're going to integrate the flexibility. And they've got different possible options of what might happen at dinner time. And the parent selects what is going to actually happen, which is this one that's highlighted in red. But you'll see later that actually what the child sees initially is that any of those three things might happen. But the key thing for the parent is that they know that all of these options are available. They know that it's appropriate, given the child's current state of development and everything, that the child has these options and the parent has control over that happening. But what we're planning to build into the system is guidance around how much flexibility you might want to give the child at any one point, and how risky, if you like, how risky that flexibility should be. And that's not to say that the system would ever take control off the parents, but it would measure what's going on based on feedback from parents, and it would make suggestions to help sort of support parents in making the decision about, okay, what am I going to do today in terms of the flexibility? And the tool also then has a child area. And so you can see the child can see their plan, and at any point, depending on what's best for them, they can tick off when they've done each thing in the plan. But you'll see here around dinner time, initially what they see is just all the different options that are available, and they see that, okay, there's this wheel here, and that indicates that when they get to that point, it's the time when they can play the game. But you can see that in this initial screen, that's locked, so that means they haven't reached there yet. And the parent has control to unlock that at the right point in the day. So when the child gets to that point, the child can then play the game, and the game selects which of these things is going to happen. So I'm going to show you an example, and the example is not the one that's on here, because the example is actually a slightly more complex one, so don't worry about that, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like. Okay, so once the child has played the game, then they see on their plan the actual thing that they need to do, and they can tick it off when they've done it. And then, really importantly, we've also built in the capacity for parents to give rewards in the game for the child, I guess, complying with that flexibility. And all of those rewards are completely individualised, so the parents decide what's going to be available and the criteria for when they should award or not. So after testing at home, what we did was just ask our families to complete 2 quite standard questionnaires that allow us to test the acceptability and feasibility. And you can see on this chart here, the blue lines and the orange lines are just 2 different questionnaires, and the dashed lines are the maximum available points, so the most acceptable possible or the most feasible possible. So you can see that all of our families are saying, yes, it is really quite acceptable, is quite feasible, which we're really, really encouraged by. And in terms of the things that were good, there were lots of things that families said were good, but we were really encouraged that some of those things are things that are ones that we were really aiming to encourage. So the fact that the structure seems to be benefiting the family, and that the child learns about flexibility and routine. And this is only within this 1 to 3 weeks of testing. Obviously, families also identified lots of problems, but what we were really encouraged by is that many of these problems are things that are already in our design that we intend to solve going forward. So all of these problems that they identified are things that we'd already thought about and we think we've already solved if we can just develop it how we're planning to develop it. But also, really importantly, families gave us some other really important information, and there's lots of really important information that they gave us. But for example, one thing that families told us was, look, if you want to encourage people to use this over, quite a long period, which is ultimately what we're aiming for, that it fits smoothly into life over, say, a year or something, you need to make sure that families are seeing basically immediate gain. And so that's something that we've been thinking about in terms of how to make sure that happens. So we're really excited about how that's going to go. And ultimately address this one pathway to temper outbursts that I talked about. But of course that's just one pathway, and there's many other pathways to this sort of behaviour and other behaviours. So one of the other things that we're trying to do is think about, okay, so what are some other pathways to these sorts of anxious outbursts? And this is where the Stay Calm project comes in, which Justin, who's sitting there embarrassing now, is leading. Give us a wave, Justin. Basically, when we're thinking about pathways to outbursts, we've got a real problem with measurement. So we've got questionnaire measures that tell us quite a lot about the kinds of behaviours that are happening, but they don't give us really much information about how, when, or why they happen. We've got diaries, which are really good at telling us lots of information, but to be able to make them practical to fill out over a long period, you would really need to know in advance some of those hows or whys so that you're asking the right questions. And we've got interviews that can give us a lot of really detailed information, but they're really time consuming, and they're always slightly different for everyone that you interview. So this creates a problem when we're thinking about trying to create profiles of temper outbursts that might give us clues to other pathways that might be important for developing other interventions. So with the Stay Calm project, what we're doing is developing a new questionnaire measure which we hope will ask all of those things that we think are important for profiling these temper outbursts. And once we've developed that questionnaire, we're asking a very large number of people, some with Fragile X syndrome, but some with other neurodevelopmental disorders, to complete that questionnaire, and then we'll use all of that information from all of those people to identify profiles of temper outbursts. So we've already developed this questionnaire. We've already developed this questionnaire, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit how we did that, because we also collaborated with families to be able to do that. So we started off by looking at questionnaires that already exist and coming up with a very long list of questions. And once we'd done that, we developed, with our expertise in the team and discussing it with some other teams, we developed a sort of prototype questionnaire. And then we went out to consult our stakeholders. So that included families of children with neurodevelopmental disorders. It included professionals who work with children with neurodevelopmental disorders. It included teachers. I'm sure there's other, Justin's laughing at me, I'm sure there's many other groups of people that I've forgotten, but many different stakeholders. And they gave us feedback on that questionnaire. So what we were asking them is, okay, so do these questions seem to be getting at what we want to get at? And how would you answer those questions? And with that information, it allowed us to think, okay, so are we actually doing what we want to do with these questions? And then we got feedback from them and we put that into the questionnaire. And what's really important at this stage, I think one of the key things that we got out of this is this name. So I've been talking about temper outbursts, but actually, as I alluded to, many people have different names for these behaviours. So we've got meltdowns, we've got tempers, we've got blips, we've got behavioural episodes. many, many names, and I can't think of all of them. And that reflects, I think, the diversity in the behaviour and in the kinds of situations when you might see it. And that's why it's really important for us to look for profiles. But the one thing that was common across all of these descriptions was that they seemed to be really emotional and really sudden. So ultimately, what families were telling us is that we should go for the term emotional outbursts. And so that's the term that we're using now, emotional outbursts. And we integrated some other changes into the questionnaire. So then, once we've got these data, and this is just to quickly show that there's lots of different kinds of questions, and I know some of these names are technical, but the key things here to think about are we're asking about the whys and the hows of when the behaviours happen, and that's some of the key things that are going to allow us to create these profiles. So, what we're hoping to do once we have all these data are look at the responses and think, okay, so given what the behaviour looks like and when it happens, can we create these groups of people who are showing more similar behaviours to people in the same group as the behaviour, like relative to the behaviours that children are showing in a different group. And once we've got those different groups, we'll look at those profiles and think, okay, so what might be going on here? And use that information to think, okay, so what's important to look at a brain or cognitive level? What's important to look at in the environment? And then design a study to test those things and develop a new pathway. So, and that's it. I didn't realise it was such an abrupt end, but I'm doing well this time. We're still recruiting for Justine's study, so if you're interested in that temporal outburst, the emotional outburst questionnaire study, then please get in touch. And thank you, first and foremost, thank you to all of the families who took part in our research. It's not possible without the families, and so everything that we do, we're indebted to you. Also to the professionals who advised us in the development of both projects, funders, organisations like Fragile X Society who supported recruitment, and thank you to Justine, who's sitting there, who's done the Stay Calm project, and Siobhan Blackwell, who couldn't be with us today, but who led the flexible scheduling project.